Welcome to United Church of Canada History, which is course number CH2105 for the winter term of 2026. My name is Ross Bartlett, and I'm so glad to be working with you this term. Now, as we begin our time together, there are some important questions to ask and answer. The basic one is, why are you taking this course? Or perhaps more honestly, because some of you may be here only because it's required of you, what do you hope you will gain from this course? And I really do want you to think about that because you are adult learners. And as adult learners, your motivation is tremendously important. Here's another important question. What comes to mind for you when you think of the study of history? One of the most fortunate experiences of my life was when I encountered, as a young person in grade 6 or 7, teachers who moved history away from the memorization of names and dates to the real lives of real people. For too many people, their memories of grade school and high school history is caught up with the memorization of apparently useless and disconnected facts. That's really not good history. When we move beyond the names and the dates, we discover some important things. It's important to realize that all history comes from a point of view. And once we move beyond the bare bones of this event happened on such or such a date and these persons were present, beyond that we're into a point of view. The technical term for that is ideology, which simply means a manner of thinking or the ideas at the basis of some system or means of analysis. This can be particularly true with religious or church history. Here's a couple of examples. Many years ago, I was in the former Soviet Union, and a tour guide referred to the Great English Bourgeois Revolution. Well, I'd never heard of that. But what she had in mind is what you and I may have learned to call the English Civil War. Speaking of civil wars, while I was doing work at Princeton, I heard a phrase I'd never encountered before. You and I probably call it the American Civil War. Classmates from the southern states referred to it as the War of Northern Aggression. So you see, even in something as simple as how we name an event, some viewpoint or ideology kicks in. Even this course, in its title, has an ideology to it, a viewpoint to it. The name United Church History assumes that there is such a thing as the United Church of Canada, that we can somehow identify items in its story, that we can name such things as church history and identify them distinctly from other events in society. And it also assumes the existence of a field of study called history with sources and methods that have some reliability and value. Now, I'll admit that some of those are very easy to identify, but it shows that clarity about language is important. Words matter. How we describe something is important. So, why study history? The first reason is a purely utilitarian one. You and I did not drop into this place in time all on our own. The church we have today, and even our own lives, are the products of different forces. Most of us are parts of communities of faith that have a history. That history, for good or ill, continues to influence that community today and has an influence on us as individuals. If we do the work to better understand those factors, then we can be more effective in ministry. Now, Just as in theology and biblical studies there are different schools and approaches, so too there are different approaches to history. Different forms of history will focus on different areas and they'll produce different results. Some of those historical schools are economic history. That focuses on economic concerns, employment, spending, and so on. Social history studies organizations that people create. Military history, as you might assume, focuses on conflict as the great driver of the human story. The history of ideas focuses on writings and ideas as the prime shapes of human story. Now, those are just a few of the historical schools. In this course, you and I will primarily engage in social and intellectual history. In other words, we'll be focusing on groups and organizations and movements of people, as well as the writings of key individuals and groups. When we study history, our social location makes a difference. We are engaged in this study through a theological school, and that adds another layer. The fact that most of you are preparing to give leadership in Christian communities adds yet another dimension. Now, in religious circles, there is a practice that sometimes masquerades as history, but is actually a distorted form of propaganda. It's not history. It involves developing an idea or establishing a position and then ransacking the storehouse of the past to find examples that support our already developed ideas. That's not the way we will do history. Let me give you an example of how historians work. There's a tragic event in comparatively recent history that illustrates this point. Some of you will recall that in April 1999 at Columbine High School near Denver, 2 teenage boys went on a murderous rampage, killing several students and teachers. In the media reports after the fact, there were numerous references to the survivors speaking of angels protecting them. Let's for a moment consider this as a focus for historical research and writing. What could we focus on, and what could we say as historians? Firstly, we can establish some things pretty clearly. An event took place, certain day, a certain time, a certain location. There were 2 individuals identified as the primary perpetrators. These individuals were killed outright. These were wounded and died or survived. The path taken by the assailants through the school looked like this. Police have discovered these tangible things about the perpetrators, websites, stashes of weapons, and so on and so on and so on. You see, what we're doing is establishing the facts of the event. Those are the historical facts with which you as a historian will work. Everything beyond that reporting becomes interpretation. So, you as a historian from that single event might develop the following. You might have a theory as to why teenage North American boys become murderous. You might want to reflect on the downsides and benefits of suburban North American life. Perhaps you'll engage theories of gun control. Maybe you'll want to talk about the presence or absence of angels in that event. Now, as historians, we call that interpretation. And interpretation is an absolutely legitimate human endeavor. Most historians go about their work because in some way we want to understand why something happened. Most historians want to try and figure out how A relates to B. With that in mind, the difference between facts and interpretation, we can ponder the claim of divine intervention. What ultimately do? We can talk about what the participants believe to be true, whether we accept it or not. We can talk about our own belief about what happened, whether or not the participants named that as a factor, as long as we're clear. What you're not free to do as a historian is to say something happened that did not happen. That's dishonest. Avoid an obvious explanation for an event. That's foolish. Deny what people claim as their own experience, even though you are free to disagree with their experience, their interpretation of that experience. So if somebody says, this is what happened to me and this is what it means, you can't deny their experience, but you can challenge your understanding of what it means. You also can't say that God did something as a fact statement rather than a belief statement, because that takes the matter out of the realm of historical discourse and moves it into apologetics. Apologetics is believers talking about how God operates and acts in the world. That's a legitimate sphere of activity, but it's not history. That doesn't mean you have to bracket your faith or put it in a closet or hide it away in order to do history. No, absolutely not. No less a person than St. Augustine taught that Christian history is neither a deterministic system nor meaningless chaos. And you can share that belief. It doesn't mean that God has determined absolutely everything that will happen, nor does it mean that everything that occurs is just random chaos. If your faith motivates you, you can see in the events of history evidence of judgment, mercy, moral meaning, significance, spirituality, and so on. You are constrained as a limited human being to recognize that no judgment, mercy, meaning, or significance is utterly unambiguous. Everything has some shades to it. But what you must do as a historian is own the conclusions you arrive at, rather than offering them as absolutes. So, for instance, if you're going to talk about God doing something, that's an opinion. It's a legitimate opinion. You can defend it, you can hold it, but you can't offer it as a statement of fact. Martin Luther wrote about the hiddenness of God in history, so that there is mystery and over-diffidence. At the risk of making sweeping generalizations, what are the marks of a historian who is also a Christian believer? First of all, they are wary of universal statements. So, for instance, when someone says everyone knows or experience tells us, we've learned that such statements usually reveal only the experience of a particular group, and that's generally the dominant group in society. So beware making universal, sweeping statements. A second point. Astute historians are aware of their own assumptions and wary of them. And so alarm bells should go off in our heads if something seems obvious to us. Are we reading or writing something from our own time and projecting that into the lives of people who lived in the past? Honest historians realize that when you're talking about history, you choose some facts to include and some to leave out. We set them down in one way and not in another. And that all involves judgment on our part. We will engage in judgment. That's unavoidable. On what basis are our judgments being made? A fourth characteristic is that reliable Christian historians are realistic and open-minded. Human nature as we encounter it in history can be pretty shocking. It's often hard as a historian to sustain a notion of the universal goodness and perfectibility of humankind. On the other hand, I think it's inappropriate to give way to pure cynicism and say that people only do things. There are times in the historical record when people act better than we expect of them. There are also times when the results turn out better than the rough beginnings would lead us to hope. So, let's return for a moment to our opening questions. I asked you, what comes to mind when you think of the study of history? But now I want to change that slightly and ask, why do you think that church history is a required part of your course of study and also part of the traditional seminary program? Why bother with history? Now, most of my life, I've been both a parish minister and a professional historian. I'm someone who reads and writes and teaches history. So let me tell you what the study of history means to me. I think that by studying history, we can enter into a conversation with those who have gone before us carrying the Christian tradition. We're trying to hear those voices left behind as clearly as possible. And so the first goal of studying history is to try and comprehend what their situation meant to those people who were involved in it. And that's harder than it may sound. We're all historical actors. We're all making history. But our motives and our actions are hardly ever focused just singly on one thing. Take us, for example. Suppose someone were to be writing the story of the class of CH2105 in the winter term of 2026. They could write that the members of the class had these names. They might note that instead of being in person in a class, it was conducted in a hybrid fashion. They could record that they met from 12 weeks from January to April. The instructor was Ross Bartlett. The TA was Jesse Crabtree. So far, that's pretty boring history. It's when you start to push on any of those things that the story gets interesting. Who were those people really? What motivated them to participate in this class? What was the relationship between them? What about the instructor? Beyond the rather boring titles of his presentations, what did he actually say and do? What happened in those sessions? In the classroom sessions, what happened in those debates and conversations? That's when history begins to come alive, as we seek to understand the whole story of people who went before us. So, what the study of history in this context is also an attempt to understand ourselves. How did we get here? Because the people and the situations on which we are reflecting and studying, they shape us today. We didn't spring into being out of nothing. Our traditions, convictions, concerns, attitudes, beliefs, practices, everything that we call church is shaped in part by those who went before us. And as historians, we take that material, we shape it again, and we pass it on to the next generation. So in studying history, we are attempting to arrive at a clear understanding of what's been passed on to us. So, in studying history, we bring our own concerns to the story. And that's why I've built freedom into this course for you to explore things in the church's story that really interest you. Why we sit in pews, or if you're a United Churchian background, why do we use little glasses for communion? Or why does the church feel the need to make comments on social issues? You might wonder about church music. You might wonder about many other things. And so you're invited in this course to go off and follow the interests and come back and report on what you discover. That way you are really acting as historians, tracing down the roots of an issue that is alive and real for you in the church today. As far as I'm concerned, history is not the memorization of names and dates. Now, dates are crucial markers if we're finding our way through the highways of time. When the First World War began, or who the moderator or prime minister is at different times, can serve as guideposts so we don't lose our way in the journey of history. Now, this is not a purely academic course. Because of where we're located in the Atlantic School of Theology, we are coming from an ideological position. And so we are interested in history. And I've learned that the people to whom you preach and whom you interact with are genuinely interested in their story. They're interested in their story to the extent that it helps them understand who they are and helps them learn about themselves. So, what will we be doing this term? I invite you to find a copy of the syllabus and have it handy. So let's walk our way through the syllabus for the course. There are some basic pieces of information about the outline and the objectives and the outcomes. I can be contacted by email and phone number that are there at the top of the syllabus. You can send emails from within Brightspace, but I've not always had good experience with that, so I encourage you not to do that. If you're telephoning me, please check the time zones. Make sure you're not calling in the middle of the night. You can also make appointments with me using the booking link that's there in the syllabus. Although it says it will expire on January 25th, in fact, it actually renews and is valid throughout the term. I'll also be holding open office hours on most Thursday morning from 10 until 12. So if you want to drop by and chat about anything, and the Zoom link is there. Now, I do attempt a quick turnaround on assignments, but there are a lot of people in this course, and that depends on numbers. So I'm trying to make a habit of acknowledging that I've received something. And if you haven't had an acknowledgement of an assignment, please be in touch because things do go astray. Now, this is a course that assumes participation in a couple of different ways. It is assumed that your camera will be on during the class unless you communicate with me about a reason for that not happening. I also expect that you will be participating in small group response and reflection and talking about items during the course. If you have some sort of situation that requires an accommodation, please let me know. Let me know in advance. Don't let me know afterwards. And then we have standards for written work and also the AI use policy. This is becoming more and more important as AI becomes more ubiquitous. There are 2 required texts plus readings that I will make available. The required texts are listed there. The readings that are available on the Brightspace page tend to be the original sources. I think it's really important when we're talking about history to try as much as we can to listen to the original voices, not just what we think about them, but what they are saying. Now, there are both MDiv and BTH and MA students in this course, and everybody is welcome. The syllabus is modified in a small way for BTH in terms of readings, reflections, and essays. Now, I encourage you to complete all parts of the course, but I recognize that BTH students can expect a different level of requirement, and so that hopefully that will be clear for you. So this course proceeds in a variety of parts. The first thing to do each week is to complete the readings, then watch the online lecture, and the online lecture will be posted on by Thursday evening prior to the Tuesday class. Our class is divided up into discussion groups of approximately 5 participants, and those are noted on the Brightspace page. And so if we think of the lecture on the Thursday evening, by Tuesday noon of the following week, each of you will have posted a reflection, and we'll talk about that. You will have posted a reflection within your discussion group. By Thursday of that week, each of you will have responded to at least one of your peers, and perhaps more. The more you connect with one another, the better. Each class will be hybrid. At least that's the intention at this point, and will begin on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Atlantic time. I will be taking the time in the lecture away from the class time. So rather than the amount of time that's listed in the course timetable, our times together will be briefer. And that will be primarily devoted to discussion, questions, response, and so on. Each of you will write 2 papers. The first is due on February the 13th, and the second on April the 2nd. And so there's an example there of how the course will flow, the link for the class meeting. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about reflections? Each week you'll post a reflection. It can be a few paragraphs, anything up to 2 pages, to show that you viewed the lecture, read the material, demonstrate your understanding of them, and maybe offer a response. You can note interesting items, maybe disagree with something that's said, maybe notice some problems. To encourage you to participate, there are marks for showing up and participating in a meaningful way. Because you're adults and adults have to make choices, the course is 12 weeks in length, but with notice to me, you can skip a week. You can skip 2 weeks, either together or at different times. If you do respond to all 12 weeks, we'll use the best 10 to determine your mark. 2 essays. Essay number 1 gives you a choice of options, and it might be a short essay, it might be an education plan, it might be a video presentation. Again, you are invited to choose something that isn't significant to you. Excuse me, and develop it as indicated there in the syllabus. Essay number 2, on the other hand, is a formal academic essay with all of the attributes thereof. I really do recommend that you email me to talk about possible sources and so on and so forth, your topic and what have you. I can hopefully provide you with good advice and perhaps point you to some resources you might not be aware of. And so there are the evaluation things that you can count on, the way in which the mark is divided. And then there are the various weeks of the course year. In many of the weeks, I've given you reflective questions, but not always. Just some things that you can think about as you're reading and writing. they are only meant for your benefit and your use. We'll have time in our first class next week to deal with questions about the syllabus, but for now I hope that's sufficiently clear to get you started. I've given you ways in which you can be in touch with me, and I invite you to take advantage of them if it's helpful. We'll see you in class.